After leaving the scene, the married senator went back to his hotel room in Edgartown, where he made 17 long-distance phone calls to friends, advisors, his brother-in-law Steve Smith, known as the Kennedy family fixer, and Helga Wagner, whom friends described as the love of Ted's life. Around 2:30 in the morning, Ted complained to the front desk about guests in a nearby room who were having a party. The noise, he said, was disturbing his sleep. Let's see, what could be disturbing your sleep? Could it be that you just murdered someone and left them to die in a car? Is that the thing that's making it a little hard to fall asleep right now, Ted? Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is True Denise. We're going to keep going in the Ask Not book by Maureen Callahan. This time we are going to be reading about Mary Jo Kopechne and Ted Kennedy. Now, this was a story I was really eager to get to because I only knew the broadest of strokes. I knew that he'd been involved with a woman named Mary Jo Kopechne, that he had crashed a car into a lake, that she had died, he pretty much left her to die, and that it had really damaged his reputation. I didn't know anything about her background. I did not know the full extent to which he had sloughed off his responsibilities in the event of this horrific tragedy, and that there's certainly more he could have done, but failed to do. In an astronomical way. Like in a way that made you think he hoped she would die. Because his response to this situation is so slow and so unpanicked that you just have to wonder, like, is he okay in the head? Like what was happening in his mind when this whole thing occurred? The slowness with which he goes in the face of extreme panic, like extreme panic should have been taking hold of his heart. It seems not to have rattled him that there was a woman drowning in the lake and that he could do something about that when I get around to it. That kind of seemed like his whole attitude about this. Well, when I get around to it. Somebody's dying! Anyway, so I was very excited to get more information about that story. Before we begin, I just want to tell you, there was an episode that came out on Monday. It has not been looked upon fondly by YouTube. I have no idea what their issue is here. No idea whatsoever. I have covered stuff in this book that probably should have gotten an age restriction, but for whatever reason that video did. We were talking about Marilyn Monroe, and we all know how things ended there. And YouTube, I guess, wants me to rewrite history and not tell you what really happened, because even though I delicately approached the subject, and even though we did not go into any kind of detail about it, YouTube couldn't handle it, and so they put an age restriction on it and issued me a letter saying, the fact that you're talking about this kind of stuff makes us worried about your mental health. Are you okay? And sent me the most condescending letter ever. And then when I tried to respond to it, I couldn't, it pinged back at me. And I'm like, if I really had some problems, that pathetic letter would not have helped. But then secondly, they're like, remember that we're here for you. And then when you try to respond, the email comes back to you. So, anyway, if you have not seen that, because it seemed, I wouldn't say shadow banned is the right word, but it got no reach whatsoever. If you did not have your little bell on for notifications, you would not have known that I put an episode up. And then when you're trying to watch the video, they continue to ask you over and over, are you sure you want to keep going? Are you sure? So, you're going to have to do your due diligence if you want to see that episode, which is really sad because it was really good. It was a really good episode. And I thought that it was very interesting. And I thought it was a good episode about Marilyn. And I really liked that episode because I really feel like we got into her humanity and her side of things. And it was great. So if you didn't get a chance to see it, I would highly recommend watching it and push on. And every time they come at you with, are you sure? Can you handle it? Do we need to hold your hand? Do you need a hot drink? Do you need a cup of tea? You can do it. I promise you've heard worse in this book than in that episode. Anyway, let's get on to Mary Jo Kopechne. The chapter begins by saying he didn't even know how to spell her last name. Well, he stood behind Police Chief Jim Arena's desk. To Arena's surprise, Ted Kennedy was already running this investigation, making calls on his phone. He struggled to formally identify the young woman whom he had left in his car the night before. A car he'd left upside down in 3 feet of water after careening off a bridge. Her name was Mary Jo. Ted could pronounce her last name, kind of, but he didn't know how to spell Kopechne. So Ted, in writing out his statement, just left that part blank. Okay, in his defense, Kopechne is an unusual last name. I don't think I've ever met somebody with the last name Kopechne. And, if you'd only ever heard the name but never seen it spelled, I don't hold it against him that he couldn't spell his name. I mean, of all the things I got to hold against Ted, it's not that. Okay? Because I think I might be hard-pressed to spell her last name. It wasn't important, really. Ted knew that some other police officer or administrative clerk would figure it out and fill it in. He had one other, equally pressing question for Chief Arena. Would he go back down to the pond? Ted wanted to be sure that his black Chevy got out and cleared okay. The news reports to follow would only prove Ted right. In headline after headline, this would be called Ted's accident, and how lucky America was that Senator Ted Kennedy survived, narrowly escaping the Kennedy curse. The young woman whom Ted left to die would be identified as the blonde or the victim. Decades later, even into the new millennium, historians and journalists and pundits would call this scandal, this callous disregard for human life, not by the dead woman's name, but by its location, Chappaquiddick, a small Massachusetts island off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Before Ted calmly reported himself to Arena that morning, he had first called Mary Jo's parents. It was Saturday, July 19th, 1969, a momentous weekend for the Kennedys. 3 American astronauts were hurtling toward the moon, a seemingly impossible goal set forth by JFK in his 1961 inaugural address. If they survived, they would land on the moon's surface shortly before 11 p.m. that night. The eyes of the world were glued to live broadcasts, with 53 million Americans watching. The goings-on at some tiny shack on Martha's Vineyard were, at that moment, inconsequential. Mary Jo's mother, Gwen, answered the phone. Ted wanted to talk to her husband instead. Joe Kopechne wasn't home, but no matter. Gwen knew something was very wrong. She would not be getting off that phone. Mary Jo, Ted said, was in an accident. Was it in a car? It was an automobile accident, Ted said. Mary Jo was returning to take a ferry back to the mainland when the accident occurred. This language was too passive, too officious. Gwen cut right to the point. Was her daughter dead? Kennedy paused. Yes. Gwen remembered nothing else other than screaming. Mary Jo's been killed. I'm alone here. Gwen's cries were so loud that she woke a neighbor who came in and found her in such hysteria that she smacked her in the face more than once. Gwen did not feel a thing. Mary Jo had been her only child. What's up with the neighbor? Somebody's screaming and crying because their child is dead and you smack them in the face repeatedly? For your benefit, because you need them to calm down. You can't handle the hysteria. So let me just hit this poor screaming woman in the face a couple of times and bring her back to coherency. Different times, friends. Ted Kennedy gave Mary Jo's parents no details. They didn't know that Ted had been driving. They didn't know that he had an expired license. He'd been drinking heavily. He'd pitched his car, their daughter inside, into the shallow waters of Pucha Pond 10 hours before. They didn't know that he had emerged from the water and walked over a mile, passing by several houses, at least one with the lights on, never knocking for help. Or that he'd passed a local firehouse. Or that he'd bypassed payphones and never called the police or 911. Her parents didn't know that the very next morning members of his staff could still smell alcohol on Ted's breath. Or that their daughter had been alive for hours, tossed upon impact into the back of the car, contorting herself upside down in the rear footwell, clutching at the back seat and craning her neck to breathe through the small pocket of air. They didn't know that John Ferrer, the diver who pulled her body out of the car, quickly determined that she'd probably lived for at least an hour after the crash, and that had Ted gotten help, Mary Jo would have been saved. Or that later, Ferrer would describe Mary Jo as having been alone in the dark water, rebreathing her own air, the oxygen turning to carbon dioxide, her emotional trauma overwhelming. I have a deep fear of small spaces. The idea of dying suffocating in a small pocket of air in deep, dark water is excruciating to imagine. Mary Jo, even in death, was immaculate. She was found in her dark blue pants and long-sleeved white shirt, her jewelry, a ring and 2 gold bracelets, intact. She was not wearing underwear. Only her chain-link belt came apart as Ferrer pulled her body from the car, her eyes and mouth open, her teeth clenched. Ferrer would later describe that last hour of Mary Jo's life in unpitying detail. Try putting a plastic bag over your head and breathing, he said. Then try to imagine that bag being held over your head by a 300-pound wrestler and think of having to struggle to get out of that situation knowing that you might be breathing your last. The anxiety that sets in is just unbelievable. Gwen and Joe Kopechne didn't know that Mary Jo waited in agony for help that never came. And why wouldn't first responders be on the scene? Who would leave a young woman to die that way? Ted Kennedy would. After leaving the scene, the married senator went back to his hotel room in Edgartown, where he made 17 long-distance phone calls to friends, advisors, his brother-in-law Steve Smith, known as the Kennedy family fixer, and Helga Wagner, whom friends described as the love of Ted's life. Around 2:30 in the morning, Ted complained to the front desk about guests in a nearby room who were having a party. The noise, he said, was disturbing his sleep. Let's see, what could be disturbing your sleep? Could it be that you just murdered someone and left them to die in a car? Is that the thing that's making it a little hard to fall asleep right now, Ted? Gwen and Joe Kopechne didn't know that the men in suits who quickly descended on their modest house in New Jersey were tried and true Kennedy men, the cleanup crew, and there not to protect the Kopechnes from the press, as they claimed, but to make sure that Ted Kennedy emerged from this disaster with his bright future intact. Ted needed to walk away from this with no felony charges, no criminal or civil trial, no prison time, and no reputational damage whatsoever. He needed a clean path to his rightful inheritance, the Oval Office. Was anybody going to ever vote for Ted Kennedy into the Oval Office? And if we as a nation did that, we would deserve every last scrap of crap we would have gotten. The girl, as Ted would continue to call her, well, she was collateral damage. The girl, he knew her, okay? Because we're going to go on to find out this was not some stranger that happened to find hitch a ride in his back seat. Okay? This is the girl, I don't know what her name is. Okay, I can forgive you for not knowing how to spell it. You knew her name, though. You did know it. The girl. Well, let's find out a little bit about the girl, okay? Mary Jo Kopechne was her name. And Mary Jo had thought little of Ted Kennedy. As everyone on the Hill knew, Ted was a legendary drunk and womanizer who cheapened high office and degraded the slain president's legacy. She deeply admired Jack Kennedy, but it was Bobby whom she'd really come to D.C. for. Bobby she loved. Mary Jo had worked for him in the Senate, babysat his children, and went to Hickory Hill, his and Ethel's famed house in Virginia, for pool parties and speechwriting. She loved his children, Bobby Jr. especially, and Bobby Jr. loved Mary Jo too. She was so good with the children and so conscientious that Ethel asked her about taking on a nanny role. But Ethel was miscalculated. Yes, there was a part of Mary Jo that was deeply old-fashioned. She was a devout Roman Catholic who had comported herself with modesty. She barely drank. She didn't smoke. She didn't appreciate body humor. But she was also ambitious and independent, determined to carve a path that felt right for her. She had been the first in her family to graduate college, Caldwell College for Women, where married students were not allowed to graduate, where literal interpretations of the Old and New Testament were taught, where premarital sex, indeed any sex outside of marriage, was considered a mortal sin and would damn you to hell for eternity. I don't think anybody in the church teaches that having sex outside of marriage is going to damn you to hell for all eternity. See, it's things like that that kind of make you just go be like, okay, Maureen Callahan, you don't really know the facts. It sounds really, really scandalous to say that you went to a school where they taught you that sex was going to damn you to hell. But you know what? Nobody in the church taught that. And if that is your interpretation of what they were saying, you didn't understand what they were saying. So, okay. But sometimes I feel like Maureen Callahan picks the parts that sound the most scandalous without necessarily being too worried whether you're going to follow up on whether that's true or not. And then you read things like that and you're like, well, that's not really what anybody would have said. Anyway, sex was a mystery to Mary Jo. Her church made it something to fear. She didn't have siblings. There was no one older to guide her, no one younger to rebel with. She didn't talk about sex with any of her friends. There was one boy in high school she was crazy about, probably her first real boyfriend. But when her friends tried to warn her that his preppy good looks masked a devious nature, she refused to believe it. And when she did finally break up with him, her friends never knew why. They could guess, but they would never dare to ask. There were lines she just didn't cross with Mary Jo. For all her enthusiasm and good nature, she held herself at a distance. No one she worked with knew her well, and neither did her friends or her boyfriends. To look at her, a sunny blonde pixie in the trendiest clothes, you could never guess at her stubbornness, her seriousness. Mary Jo knew that she was pretty. She liked to party, and she loved to dance. And that was the only time anyone saw her out of control and unself-aware. Her dancing had a ferocity to it, as if everything she suppressed, her anger, her fears, her desires, and sexual energy, used that single socially acceptable expression to escape. It was a burden at times being an only child, especially a girl. Her parents worried over her as if she would break. When she told them that she wanted to teach on an Indian reservation, they begged her not to go. When she changed her mind and got a job teaching at a Catholic high school in Montgomery, Alabama, a flashpoint of the civil rights movement, her parents again begged her not to go. Every time they came to visit, they harped on every reason she should come back to New Jersey with them. It could feel infantilizing. Mary Jo was 22 years old, and like so many young American women of her generation, she was a study in contrasts. She seemed meek, but was driven. She was humble and grounded, yet drawn to the glamour of the Kennedys, a family and a world in which she wanted to belong. She had a sharp mind and a lacerating wit, but she knew how to hold back in polite company. Mary Jo was fearless when it came to her beliefs, and remaining a virgin until marriage was paramount among them, no matter how many men broke up with her over it. Not long after her move to D.C., she began to see a young lawyer named Owen Lopez. They were together for a couple of years, long distance. But when she would visit, Mary Jo would always insist on staying anywhere other than with Owen. Her devotion to God, the Catholic Church, and Bobby Kennedy, in that order, meant there would be no sex for this single girl who otherwise, in many ways, was ahead of her time. I don't know if you guys read The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Lois Perry. But I have to say that it really blows to smithereens this idea that running around having sex like a man was some kind of improvement in our society. And that book is not written by somebody who is religious whatsoever. It's not written by a conservative. It's not written by somebody who you would assume would have anything negative to say. But this idea that, she was really ahead of her time. It's too bad, her sexuality couldn't catch up with all of the other things about her. Maybe she was even more ahead of her time than this author would suggest. Because maybe she looked at it as like, why should I give that up? Why should I run around and act like a pig? That doesn't make me any more free. I can do anything I want. I'm not going to give up the thing that belongs to me to some guy who, if he wants to break up with me because I won't give him my body, okay, fine, there's the door. I don't have to bargain for your love and affection by giving it to you. I don't. If you really care that much, let's go. Let's get married. I'm not just going to scatter myself to the winds for all this male attention. No, thank you. To me, I would say that Mary Jo Kopechne had her head on straighter than a lot of the girls in this book. Anyway, men were for the moment, and they were a lesser concern. Mary Jo was building a foundation for her future as a working woman, actively contributing to bettering life for those who suffered. The poor, the minorities denied basic human rights, and if she thought about it, women like herself. She considered her year teaching in Montgomery a kind of tithing, a gift of service and self-sacrifice before moving on to her larger goal, working for social justice on Capitol Hill. Ideally for Bobby Kennedy, and someday in the White House after she helped make him president. Bobby, to Mary Jo, was the country's best hope. It was he alone of all the Kennedys and all the politicians, really, who cared about the things she did, poverty and racism and social inequality. Mary Jo called Bobby, quote, the answer. Late summer of 1963, Mary Jo's year of teaching had left her emotionally depleted. She had trouble creating boundaries with her students, and she felt herself trying to solve all sorts of problems that extended beyond the classroom. She told her mother that she hadn't yet figured out how to help others while protecting herself. How could she share her talents, her essential goodness, without giving other people her entire being? When was it kind to herself and to others to say no? When she arrived in Washington that summer, she had hoped to work for President Kennedy. But Mary Jo didn't have the upper-class sheen, that boarding school world traveler hauteur that so appealed to JFK's snobbery. Mary Jo wasn't like Mimi Alfred or Diana DeVay. She didn't give off a knowing vibe, much less an available one. So instead, she was offered positions with two other congressmen. One was with George Smathers, JFK's great friend in the Senate and at sea. Smathers, the one who had broken up Jack's party cruise in the Med after Jackie's stillbirth, telling her husband that he'd never be president if he stayed on that boat. Mary Jo knew that Smathers and President Kennedy were close, so she went to work for him as a way of getting to the president. And when the president died, Mary Jo, heartbroken, persuaded Smathers to let her go work for Bobby instead. She had kept a framed photo of Bobby on her desk that whole time. How could Smathers say no? I think that's a little bit weird. I don't know. I mean, I guess you can keep a framed photo of anybody you want on your desk. Who says you can't? But you work for one senator and you have a picture of another senator framed on your desk. Like, isn't your desk? I don't know. I just feel like I wouldn't have any pictures of anybody framed on my desk who weren't like close family or friends or something like that. And maybe Bobby was a close family friend. I mean, after all, it says that she was babysitting for them. But I don't know if she was babysitting for them at this point. Like when she went to go work for him, I'm sure she was used as a bit of a babysitter then. But, it's a little interesting. Just different. His mission consumed her. Mary Jo worked harder for Bobby than she had for her beloved students, rising quickly from secretary to advanced woman in charge of staging campaign stops to speechwriting aide to one of 6 so-called boiler room girls, toiling in a windowless chamber as they tracked delegates around the country, worked up policy positions, and gathered and synthesized the kind of data that Barack Obama's team would use much later, and with much greater technology, to win the presidency. For her work, which extended to nights and weekends, Mary Jo earned $7,500 a year. Her male counterparts were earning twice that. Mary Jo was Bobby's star, the sharpest and most dedicated of his junior staff. She was so pretty that her office nicknamed her Twiggy, like the ultra-mod, doe-eyed model. Behind her back, the other women called her a prude. Yet as Bobby's profile ramped up, and his candidacy for president was announced, rumors circulated, in New York and D.C., that he and Mary Jo were having an affair. See, I just don't know that this could possibly be true. I mean, maybe it is. For a girl who had said no to every other guy in her life, who had pushed her and prodded her and wanted her to move faster than she wanted to move, it seems strange that she would say yes suddenly now to Bobby, but then again it was Bobby Kennedy. Her whole life was dedicated to working for him. She had a framed picture of him on her desk, when as yet she did not work for him. That's kind of weird, and she might have broken her own rules to be with him, but I don't know, it just doesn't seem like this was part of who she was. It seemed like she kind of knew who she was all along, and that she didn't need male attention the way some of the other characters in this book seem to have needed it. Now, the book, however, says it wasn't that outlandish, these rumors of the affair. Mary Jo and Bobby did travel together while campaigning, and they did stay in the same hotels. It was no secret that Mary Jo was in love with Bobby. The men she dated knew that they couldn't compare. For Mary Jo, Bobby Kennedy and whatever he or his family needed came first. "She'll never marry me," one boyfriend told Mary Jo's father. "She's married to the Kennedys." And the boyfriend was right. If Mary Jo heard the rumors about her and Bobby sleeping together, she never said a thing. Whispers like that were just another way to discredit women who were outperforming men. Mary Jo knew her value, and she knew that if Bobby won the White House, there was no doubt that he'd be taking her with him. How many junior male staffers did Bobby hold in similar esteem? She was the one weighing in on the drafts of his speeches. She was the one who could mock him and get away with it. "Everything you've ever wanted," she told him after his staff gifted him a globe. "The whole world." Bobby laughed. He loved it. Mary Jo's irreverence and self-deprecation delighted him. She knew she wasn't one of the cool kids and didn't try to compensate. Instead, she would joke about how square she was. This endeared her to Bobby, who, by turns, could be shy, mean-spirited, compassionate, vengeful, empathetic, religious, unfaithful, ruthless, a marvel with little children, and the most attentive listener one could hope for. He gifted Mary Jo a framed photo of herself at her desk, the back of her head to the camera. "You work so hard," he inscribed. "This is the only way I ever see you." Mary Jo had a guileless view of the world. There was a right and a wrong, good and evil, heaven and hell. She still kept dolls and stuffed animals in her childhood bedroom, right under more photos of JFK and Bobby. Bobby to her was all good. In turn, he spared Mary Jo the worst of himself. Yeah, because people a lot of times will show up for you the way you believe them to be. So if somebody sort of opened the door for his deviousness, he would have entered that door. But Mary Jo really idolized him and thought the best of him, and I'm sure he didn't want to shatter that image. The book goes on, though, to discuss that even though there did seem to be sort of a naivete about her, or sort of this stubborn religiosity, the truth is she was born for politics, and she understood all that came with it. Compromise, moral and otherwise, the massaging of inconvenient truths, the power of images and how to manipulate them. She was drawn to the counterculture and obsessed with the musical hair. On an advanced trip to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in the fall of 1966, it was Mary Jo who figured out that Bobby's designated speaking location needed to be moved so that the television cameras would capture even a small crowd looking like 10,000 fans. Bobby was the Beatles. Mary Jo understood how to make him so, how to cut through his earnestness, his tragic legacy and self-seriousness. When he announced his run for president of the United States on March 16, 1968, it became her mission to get the American electorate to see Bobby as she did. The answer. On June 5, 1968, Los Angeles, 12:02 a.m., Mary Jo was at the Ambassador Hotel when Bobby finished addressing his supporters in the embassy ballroom. The California primary results were in, and Bobby was the leading Democratic candidate, ahead of his nearest rival by 7%. Lyndon Johnson, who had succeeded Jack after the assassination, had announced that he would not be seeking a second term. The nation had been further traumatized by the escalating war in Vietnam and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on a Memphis hotel balcony on April 4th. Bobby was poised to be a bookend of healing, the younger Kennedy brother, who was preaching unity and grace. It was Bobby who had broken the news of MLK's death to a largely black crowd of thousands in Indianapolis, and who, despite his inordinate privilege, helped ease the collective shock. Wearing a black overcoat that had belonged to Jack, Bobby quoted a passage that had meant a great deal from him. He said, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or they be black. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man, and to make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. It was a speech Bobby himself had cobbled together on the fly, yet it was the most heartfelt and impactful of his political career. It was that kind of humanity that was going to make him the next president of the United States. "So my thanks to all of you," Bobby said in his LA victory speech, "and on to Chicago and let's win there." It was his last line of the night, the crowd at the Ambassador going crazy for him, chanting, "We want Bobby," over and over. He was meant to be safe among his people, yet two of America's most prominent black athletes, friends of Bobby's, had volunteered to bodyguard for him that night. Rafer Johnson, the two-time Olympic decathlete, and former NFL lineman Rosie Greer. Despite what had happened to Jack, presidential candidates were still not afforded Secret Service protection. Bobby had mentioned both men in his speech. "To my old friend, if I may, Rafer Johnson is here," Bobby said, "and to Rosie Greer, who said he'd take care of anyone who didn't vote for me." Bobby began making his way to the ambassador's back exit through the kitchen. Ethel, who'd been by his side as he spoke, was trailing just behind. Reporters, busboys, and kitchen staff surrounded him, as did photographers and television cameras. The dispersing crowd outside could hear what sounded like a thump, but no one blanched. "RFK!" they chanted. "RFK!" That thump had been the first of 3 gunshots. Now Bobby Kennedy lay on the kitchen floor bleeding as Johnson and Greer subdued the gunman. A 17-year-old immigrant busboy from Mexico named Juan Ramiro cradled Bobby's head as he struggled to speak. His lips were moving, but no words came out. Ramiro lowered his ear to Bobby's mouth. "Is everybody okay?" Bobby asked. His blood was pouring through Ramiro's fingers. "Yes," Ramiro said. "Everybody's okay." He took his rosary from his shirt pocket and wrapped around Bobby's right hand while holding Bobby's head off the cold concrete floor. Bobby turned his head slightly. "Everything's going to be okay," he said. On June 6th, at 1:44 a.m., after one day in intensive care at LA's Good Samaritan Hospital, Robert F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He had been shot 3 times, the fatal bullet through his head. His assassin, Sirhan Sirhan, later said that he killed Bobby for his pro-Israel views and for contributing to the persecution of Palestinians. Bobby's death was yet another national trauma. His campaign itself, which prioritized civil rights and the eradication of poverty, had been a balm for the assassinations of JFK and MLK. Bobby Kennedy had allowed, encouraged really, America once again to look to the future with hope, to reject the carnage of the 1960s. Now Bobby was another victim of that carnage. His body was flown back to New York City. Thousands lined up to view his casket at St. Patrick's Cathedral before it was taken by train to Washington, where thousands more stood along the route and saluted. Ted Kennedy, the last surviving Kennedy brother, eulogized him, a eulogy written not by Ted himself but Kennedy's speechwriters. This eulogy came to define Bobby's legacy. Part of it went this way: "My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life, to be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. As he said many times in many parts of this nation to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?" That's where we're going to end for today. I am astounded about the beginning of this chapter. And, as we continue on the story, we're going to pick that tragic night back up and we're going to talk at length about what Ted Kennedy failed to do in the moment of crisis. And it really is sad that Bobby Kennedy seems like he would have been the best candidate for presidency more than any of the other brothers. And it's really sad that first it was Jack, who I just don't think had it to be president. I think he just happened to look better on camera. And he was a war hero, so I think people chose him out of feelings of patriotism. But I don't think he had what it takes. I think he was too distracted and in pain and confused and on too much medication. Then we have Bobby Kennedy, who I think really would have been a good candidate. I think he really, I know he had all of his personal stuff. I mean, that guy had just as many affair partners as his brother. But, I think he had some true goals and ideals. But it all came to naught because we were left with Ted Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy was like the worst of the lot. Now, I do have some compassion for Ted because I feel like he really had a harder childhood than the other kids because he wasn't as intellectually bright. And even though he's good at sports, and even though, he was so good at sports that the Green Bay Packers wanted him to play for them. Anyway, he didn't take that route. He still was like pedaling behind his brothers, trying to be like, I could be a politician too. He just didn't have what it takes. And he was just too much of a clown. And that had been his role in the family, to kind of be a clown and stuff. And so now when he was trying to do serious things, he couldn't. But even for all of that, even if he hadn't been as smart or, if he wasn't as good looking, who cares about that kind of stuff? What kind of person are you in the dark? Well, you're the kind of person that would leave somebody to drown in 3 feet of water. And that's really what I care about. Anyway, we're going to pick up on that story next time. Thank you for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the comments. Bye.